Hi, so carrying on from my last video where I was forced to get married at 16, I came back from Bangladesh. I was unwell and pregnant, and my mum had forced me to get married when I was only 16 against my will, and she'd kind of blackmailed me into going to Bangladesh to get married. So when I came back to the UK, I was unwell. I was pregnant, three and a half months pregnant, and my brother had a lot of behavioural issues, so he was referred to child psychology for a child psychologist to come and help my mother manage his behaviour, because he used to go completely out of control. He would lash out, he'd break furniture, he'd break his broken doors before, he'd hit, he'd scream, he'd shout, he'd become completely sort of uncontrollable. So the way my mum would deal with that would be to get all of us sisters to actually hold him down, because we're six sisters and one brother. So we'd actually hold him down, and then we would get our scarves and we'd tie his hands and we'd tie his legs, and then we'd tie him to the stair banister. Well, my mum would tie him to the stair banister, and then to add some excitement for her, I guess, she would get chili powder and she'd rub it into his face and his eyes and his nose and his mouth, and he'd be screaming and shouting and writhing in pain. He must have been about 6, 7, 8 at the time, and she'd laugh, she'd find it funny. She seemed to get enjoyment from watching him in pain and screaming and crying. Even though he was the adored son, he was the only son out of 7 children. My parents had prayed for a son. They tried repeatedly for a son. They were so happy when he was born. They'd spoil him rotten. He'd get everything he wanted. He got computer games, he got toys to play with, and we had nothing to play with. So he was spoiled in every way possible, but it came to the point where, because he was so spoiled, he would expect everything. And he'd be very demanding, and if he didn't get it, then he would lash out at whoever was around and whatever was around. So she struggled to manage that behaviour. So when the child psychologist came, and I was the eldest at the time at home, my 2 older sisters had been married, so I'm still at home at 16, and I was the one that was asked to speak to the child psychologist, because my mother's English isn't so great, and neither is my father's, so I would interpret for her, and I would speak to the child psychologist, and we built a very good rapport. I got on really well with her. I have always had a keen interest in child psychology and psychology in general. At the time, I didn't actually realise that was what I was interested in. I was doing child development at school for GCSE, and I got an A star, which is 100% in my GCSE exams, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved learning about it. I also loved practicing child psychology in my everyday life. I'd always looked after children from the age of about 3, when my younger sister was born. I would be sat on top of the bed as a 3-year-old coming home from nursery, sat on the bed with a newborn baby in my lap while my mum hoovered, my mum got on with her chores and things. So as far as I can remember, I've always looked after children. I've always had an amazing bond with children. Usually anybody's children, if I go to somebody's house, if I'm meeting friends, family, anybody, I can usually build a very good rapport with any child, regardless of the age, regardless of the background, regardless of if they've got behavioural issues and things. I can usually find something in common to connect with that child, and then to build a rapport with them. So so when the child psychologist was speaking to me about my brother's behaviour, for a while I should do weekly visits, so she'd come in regularly, and I can't remember exactly how long this went on for, but she would come in quite regularly, and we built a very good rapport, and she seemed to really like me genuinely, and I liked her, and I would sit there and chat to her and almost analyse my brother's behaviour myself, and to say, well, he does this and he does that, and maybe it's because of this, maybe it's because of that. After a while, and I built a really good rapport with her, I actually said to her, I said, well, my mum actually ties him to the banister and rubs chili powder in his face, and she's quite physically abusive with us all, hitting with belts, with shoes, with branches from the tree, broomsticks, whatever she could find at hand, she would normally grab hold of and hit us with it. I remember when I was 8, 9 years old, and my uncle had come round, and she sent me to the kitchen to make a cup of tea for him, and I must have put too much water in the kettle because it seemed to take forever to boil, and I had the teacup ready. I had the sugar and the tea leaf in the teacup waiting for the kettle to boil. She suddenly stormed into the kitchen and she said, "Why is it taking you so long to make a cup of tea? It doesn't take that long." And she grabbed the broomstick that was next to us and she proceeded to beat me with a broomstick at the age of 8, 9, because apparently I took too long to make the cup of tea. So I was rolling about on the floor with the contents of the teacup around me. The sugar, the tea leaf, the tea saucer, the cup was rolling about on the floor with me while she was beating me with a broomstick. Yeah, so... Right, so when the child psychologist was asking me about my brother, and I told her how abusive our mother was to us, that got referred to social services, and all of a sudden social services are involved, and they would come and speak to us. It's a bit of a blur because I don't actually remember exactly what happened around that time, but it was a very eventful few months where I'd just been married, and then I was pregnant, and a child psychologist got involved and the social services got involved, and as a result my mother was no longer able to physically beat us, so she with them questioning us and getting involved and sort of teaching her new techniques and suggesting ways of actually managing inappropriate behaviour or unwelcome behaviour. I had 3 younger sisters and 1 brother. They were allowed to then have a social life. They were allowed to go to the leisure centre. They were allowed to have clubs and hobbies that they were allowed to do, whereas like the 3 older sisters, me and my 2 older sisters, we weren't actually allowed to do any of that. We weren't allowed to have friends. We weren't allowed to go to visit friends. We weren't allowed to have friends over. We weren't allowed to go to clubs or leisure centres or do any kind of activities that weren't to do with school or our extracurricular studies that we had to do at the mosque and at the Bengali classes that we attended. So their lives actually improved greatly, which was great, which, you know, it was a good positive result as a result of me referring her to social services and telling them about the abusive behaviour. She didn't actually get any reprimand for it because my 2 older sisters kind of like gaslighted me to social services and just said, well, she's just depressed, or she hasn't got a clue what she's talking about. I remember having a conversation with the child psychologist who actually said, well, you've never mentioned this before and you've always supported your mum and whenever you've spoken to me. So it's almost like nobody believed me. Nobody really believed that why a 16-year-old girl would actually come out and say these things. If it wasn't true, there must be some truth in it. But as far as they're concerned, well, I don't know, maybe she's confused, she's depressed, she's doesn't get on with her mum, so she's trying to get back at her mum. So life continued, and my mum still didn't like me at all. And then I had the baby, and I was still only 16 when I had my first child, and I had postnatal depression. And I was, as it was the first child and I was only 16, they actually kept me in the hospital for 5 days after the baby was born. So they taught me sort of how to look after him, how to manage him. I mean, I already had so much experience with young children and babies, cousins. My auntie, who, whenever she had a baby, she had 3 consecutive babies, one after another each year. I would go around to her house and help her, and that was from the age of about 10, 11. I was helping her with her babies, with her children. I had my own siblings to look after. I had a niece at that point who I used to play with and things. So I have had experience. So when they taught me how to sort of look after the baby, that was fine. You know, I was able to cope. I did get baby blues, so I wasn't sleeping with a newborn baby, it's expected. But when I got home, my mum just wanted to take over. You know, I used to always hear this, I've brought up 7 children, I know what I'm talking about, you need to do this and you need to do that. And I'd repeatedly say to her, well, they've shown me, I do know how to look after him, you know, it's my baby, I would like to do things the way they've shown me, as opposed to the way you've been doing for the last 50 years. You know, it's not necessarily going to be the same techniques. But she wasn't happy about that, she wanted to do it herself.